Ever catch yourself wishing you had that, that special something, that thing that makes people really listen when you talk? Like you just radiate this magnetism that draws them in.
Ah, you mean that certain je ne sais quoi.
Yeah, exactly. Well, get ready to unlock it today. We're taking a deep dive into that very idea, exploring William Walker Atkinson's The Secret of Mental Magic, to see what he had to say about personal magnetism, mental suggestion, all that good stuff.
Definitely good stuff. And we're talking way back 1907 when this book was first published, so you know it's vintage.
Like opening a time capsule of wisdom, right?
Mhm.
But before we get too far, we should probably mention this isn't about pulling rabbits out of hats or anything.
Right, you hit the nail on the head there. Atkinson, he was way ahead of his time. He saw mental magic as this force, a real force that's everywhere. It's in your personal presence, your charisma, even, and this might surprise you, it pops up in practices that go back centuries.
Okay, now you've got to elaborate. What kind of practices are we talking about?
Okay, so think back to ancient Egypt. Atkinson was really big on how those priests and even those Persian magi we've all heard of, they didn't just dabble in what we might call, for lack of a better term, the occult. You know, the hidden knowledge, the secret practices. They were masters at suggestion, and not just for healing either.
You're saying they used it to influence people on a larger scale.
Exactly. Think about swaying crowds, even turning prophets, all through the power of the mind. Kind of makes you think, right?
It really does. Makes you wonder how much of what we think of as mystery is really just tapping into a part of ourselves that we haven't fully explored. So if this mental magic isn't some parlor trick, how did Atkinson explain how it works? He uses some pretty interesting words to describe it. Mentation, mentative currents, almost like he invented his own language.
It can sound pretty complex, but it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. Mentation, for example, is just a fancy way of saying any type of mental activity you do. Atkinson believed that when you think, you're creating energy, and that energy, it flows outward in these currents. Imagine ripples moving across a pond.
Okay, I can kind of picture that. So we're sending out these invisible ripples of thought energy all the time.
You got it. And those ripples, those currents, they're not empty. They carry your mental state. And here's the wild part. They can actually induce similar states in other people. You know how some people just have good vibes or bad vibes? That's exactly what Atkinson was getting at.
So we're all sending out these thought waves, and they're actually strong enough to make other people think or feel a certain way? That's kind of a lot to take in, isn't it?
It is, it is. But thankfully, it's not quite so simple that we're all just overwhelmed by everyone else's mental energy 24/7.
So there's like a natural defense system in place.
Exactly. Atkinson, he uses this great example talking about when that battleship, the USS Maine, sank. Remember that? It was a huge tragedy.
Yeah, I remember learning about it in history class.
Well, the collective grief and outrage back then, it was palpable. But imagine if everyone had found out instantly all at the same time. It would have been utter chaos, right? But instead, the news traveled gradually, so people's emotions, they had time to process.
I never thought about it like that before, but it makes sense.
It shows how strong those collective feelings can get, but also that there are limits. It's not a free-for-all in our minds, thankfully.
Okay, that is reassuring. But this is where it gets really interesting, right? How do we go from just passively sending out vibes to actively using this mental magic?
That's where mental suggestion comes in.
Mental suggestion, huh? So are we talking like full-on hypnotism here? Because that always seemed a little creepy to me.
Well, Atkinson does use that example about a person being hypnotized to show just how potent suggestion can be. But don't worry, everyday suggestion, it's way more subtle, thankfully. Think of it less like mind control and more like, gently nudging someone in a certain direction.
Okay, so not quite as scary as I thought. So how does it work? How do you actually suggest something to someone without them realizing it?
Atkinson, he breaks it down into four main avenues, almost like strategies for making these suggestions stick. He calls them acquiescence, imitation, association, and repetition.
Those sound awfully technical. Can you break those down a bit?
Yeah.
For those of us who don't speak fluent psychology.
Of course. So acquiescence, that's a fancy way of saying that we tend to say yes way more easily than no, especially if the person asking seems like an authority figure.
Well, I know that's true. I can never say no to my doctor.
Exactly. Then you've got imitation. And this one's pretty straightforward. We're hardwired to copy each other, whether we realize it or not.
Oh yeah, like fashion trends. Or those viral dance crazes everyone was doing.
Exactly. Atkinson even uses the example of crime sprees, which, before you get any ideas,
Yeah, no crime sprees for me, thanks.
trust me, is more about highlighting how strong social influence can be, for better or worse. And that leads us nicely to association. Think about a word, let's say, love. What pops into your head when you hear that?
Oh, well, I think about my family, my dog, maybe.
Yeah.
Warm, fuzzy feelings for sure.
See? And someone else might hear that and have a totally different reaction based on their own experiences. And that right there is association. Words only have the power we give them.
It's like we all have our own secret dictionaries in our heads filled with emotional responses.
Exactly. And then finally, we have repetition. You know that saying, water wears away stone?
Yeah. Slow and steady wins the race.
It's kind of the same idea with repetition. Even a message that's totally bogus, if you hear it enough times, it can start to feel true. Like those annoying jingles you can't get out of your head.
Oh, tell me about it. Those things are insidious.
It's why advertising works, and even why propaganda can be so darn effective. Which, speaking of suggestion, makes you wonder about Atkinson's book, doesn't it? It's like he's planting these ideas in our minds as we're reading.
Whoa, meta. You're right. It's like we're getting a first-hand demonstration of suggestion just by learning about it.
Exactly. And he wants us to think critically about every message that comes our way, right? To build up our defenses against any kind of unwanted influence. But it's not just about protecting yourself. It's also about knowing how to use this force, this mental magic, ethically, for good.
So how do we do that? How do we level up from defense to, what, offense?
I'd say more like conscious influence. And that's where personal magnetism comes in. The million-dollar question is, are we born with it or can we learn it? What do you think?
I've always wondered that myself. Some people just have that it factor, they
Mhm.
walk into a room and everyone just stops and stares. Me, I feel like I blend into the wallpaper most of the time.
It's a bit of both, actually. Nature and nurture, according to Atkinson. He uses this term, the magnetic man.
Magnetic man. Sounds a bit old-fashioned, but I'm intrigued.
I know, right? And before you ask, even though he uses the word man, this applies to everyone.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Don't want to leave anyone out of the magnetic fun. So what are the secrets of this, shall we say, magnetic persona? Spill the tea.
Oh, Atkinson breaks it down into a few key traits. First, he says this magnetic persona, they have this strong inner connection, almost like they're plugged into some kind of greater purpose, something bigger than themselves.
So it's not necessarily about religion, but more like unwavering confidence, knowing who you are and what you stand for.
You got it. And that actually feeds into the second trait, a burning desire. These folks, they don't just want things, they crave them, like with every fiber of their being. And that drive, that intensity is contagious.
It's like they're radiating passion, and other people pick up on that. So it's
Yeah.
more about genuinely feeling that drive and just trying to fake it.
100%. You can't fake authenticity. Right.
Yeah.
And then Atkinson, he gets into this whole thing about the magnetic voice.
Oh, here we go. So do I need to enroll in voice acting classes now?
No, no, no. It's not about having a specific type of voice. It's more about the tone and intention you put behind your words. Imagine a really good actor. The way they can convey a whole spectrum of emotions just by changing their tone.
Okay, so it's more about how you say it than what you say, in a way. What about body language, though? Does that factor into all of this magnetism?
Absolutely. Atkinson talks about the expressive eye, not like staring people down or anything.
Because, yeah, that could go from magnetic to creepy real quick.
Right. It's more about really seeing the person you're talking to, connecting, focusing.
It's like that saying, the eyes are the windows to the soul. But even with all of this, I have to admit, not everyone feels comfortable being that, I don't know, assertive or outwardly magnetic. It might even feel kind of fake to them.
You bring up a great point, and that's where balance comes in. It's not about turning into some kind of super influencer who tries to dominate every room, right? It's about finding what feels genuine for you. Because if you're forcing it, people will see right through that.
It's like wearing a mask eventually gets uncomfortable and you just want to rip it off.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about using these techniques in a positive way, but what about the flip side? What did Atkinson have to say about folks who might use this mental magic for, well, not so good purposes?
Yeah, the potential for misuse is definitely there, and Atkinson acknowledges that. He talks about black magic and what he calls adverse treatments as very real things. But he's also very clear that their power relies heavily on the other person's belief and fear.
So if you don't believe in it, it can't hurt you, like that whole mind over matter thing.
It's not quite that simple, but you're on the right track. Atkinson was a big believer in knowledge being the best defense against any kind of harmful influence. When you understand how something works, it's a lot harder for someone to use it against you. It's about building up those mental defenses. He even gives you some affirmation that you can use.
Okay, so it's like building up your mental immune system, so to speak.
Exactly. And we can even take those affirmations a step further and turn them into actions. First and foremost, assert your individuality. You're allowed to choose with thoughts and influences you let into your mind.
You're not obligated to let everyone rent space in your
Yeah.
head, right? Set some boundaries.
Exactly. Next up, question your impulses. Don't just blindly react to every thought or feeling that pops up. Hit the pause button. Ask yourself, does this serve me? Is this really what I want?
It's like that split second where you have a choice, fight or flight. But for your mind, choose wisely.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And finally, visualize that protective aura around yourself. Not literally, of course, but there's a real power in setting those energetic boundaries.
It's like having a force field around your mind, deflecting all those unwanted vibes. I love it. So to sum up this whole deep dive, it's really about recognizing that our thoughts have power, right?
Wow.
Not just over ourselves, but over the world around us.
Exactly. And it's about being mindful of what we put out there, about using that influence consciously. Remember, if your thoughts are like ripples in the ocean of mind, what kind of waves are you sending out?
That is a powerful question, and one I think we could all benefit from asking ourselves a little more often. This has been quite the journey into the power of mental magic. It turns out the real magic wasn't hidden in some ancient book after all.
It was within us all along.
And on that note, we'll leave you to unlock your own inner magician. Until next time, keep those mental currents flowing.